Take it away, buddy.
Hello, I'm Ketan Kapadia, and I'm the co-founder and CEO at BlokSec Technologies. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for joining us on day 3 of the 2021 CISO Forum. What an event it has been so far, with some of the great minds in the cybersecurity community coming together and sharing some really insightful information with us over the last 3 days. And again, I want to thank you all for joining us today to have this conversation around frictionless experience in zero trust security, especially with the elimination of passwords. So obviously this is going to be a very interesting topic, and part of the conversation here is to sort of understand as to where do we sort of see the aspect of identity go. So when we look at people are now becoming the new perimeter in this perimeterless world, so how do we prove them? How can we ensure that you are the individual who you say who you are, right? How can we ensure that solutions like decentralized authentication, especially gravitating towards passwordless, how does that ensure the assurance from an identity perspective? And really also looking at the context of, can passwordless be achieved across every industry? So before we sort of dive into this interesting topic and, going through some interesting conversations over here, I want to introduce to our panelists today. And Kevin, if I can start off with you, please.
Thanks for having me today. My name is Kevin Magee. I'm the Chief Security Officer for Microsoft Canada, and I lead a national team of technical specialists that focus on working with our customers to build out their zero trust network, as well as modernizing their SOCs. So lots of interest in this topic for me in particular.
Thank you, Kevin. Jason, do you want to go next, please?
Absolutely, Jasen Meece. Thanks for having me. Principal here at EY, Ernst & Young. I have been in the cyber and tech space for a little over 20 years now, both on the product and services side. So we'll spend some time talking about that convergence between people, process, and product. Excited to be here. And if you start to think about the backdrop of the conversation here of zero trust, not just as an enabling set of technology and programs, it's also a philosophical view. And what does it mean to actually start to instantiate that? So thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Thanks, Jason. Ernie?
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you attending today. My name is Ernie Tkac. I am an advisor to the BlokSec team and have been in the security product mostly, and also some services for over 20 years, from access management and identity governance and even privileged access management. Really think it's an important topic, as I've been in this space for quite some time, and the evolution to getting to frictionless is quite important. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernie. And Mike?
Yeah, hi, thanks. So my name is Mike Gillan. I'm the co-founder and CTO of BlokSec Technologies. BlokSec is a provider of passwordless secure authentication as a service. We're based out of the Durham region here, so we're a local company. And it's a very great honor and privilege to be here to speak with you today. So thanks very much for having me.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for the introduction. So let's get into some interesting conversations. I know throughout the last 3 days, zero trust has been sort of a common theme across many of the conversations, through various panel conversations. So Ernie, I'm going to put you on the hot seat first and kind of just trying to get your perspective on, what do you see as zero trust in a perimeterless world?
Thank you, Ketan, and a good question on a topic we're all very familiar with. Businesses have established and existed within a perimeter for quite some time, and once fine-tuned and established, it provided a level of comfort that an organization was secure from outside threats. We all now understand that this traditional perimeter does not exist in a world of digital transformation and cloud-first approach. So the goal in today's perimeter, in the perimeterless world, would be to extend a zero trust best practices and architecture and achieve the same level of comfort that the perimeter once provided, but in today's modern world. So how do we begin to accomplish this? And more specifically, where do you start? For today's topic, I think a couple of key areas to begin with are, leveraging the security and identity solutions to help verify the identity before the perimeter is accessed. I think that, looking at solutions such as passwordless authentication, verifiable identities, making sure that that identity has been verified, and then consent-based authorization are just a few areas, I believe, where you should focus in a long list of items that really fulfill that zero trust architecture and footprint.
Great. Thank you. Do any of other panelists want to chime in and provide some additional insights on this particular
Yeah,
topic?
one thing I'd like to add to leverage off of what Ernie just went through is going back to the aforementioned comment during the introduction. This is more than just a technical play, right? This is a philosophy that organizations have to adopt so they have the right program and processes in place as well. And what I mean by that is zero trust starts to decentralize everything. And while technically it pushes it to the edge of the service, you now need to understand who's accessing that data. How do you start to do it near real time? It becomes scalability issues. But more importantly, you're touching a lot of personal and private data through that authentication and authorization process. So you've got to be mindful of what happens there in addition to the data set they're actually trying to access.
Great. So obviously, we've kind of established this sort of notion of what zero trust means in this perimeterless world. But then to add on to that, Jason, how does identity play in that overall, security model when it comes to zero trust?
Yeah, great question. And to kind of expand a little further, when we think about identity and the digital identity here, none of these topics are new necessarily, right? This concept of distributed identity, decentralized identity, self-sovereign identity goes back to the Liberty Alliance in the early 2000s. And so we've been trying to push towards this, but there hasn't really been the processes yet for cloud as an enabling technology, nor everyone's realization. So if you take this up a level before we get to answer that question, when we talk about identity, it's a know your customer. So it's a KYC play. It's a data privacy issue, right? We all know the headlines. We won't spend a whole lot of time digging into that one on this one. You've got regulatory compliance issues and you've got cybersecurity issues. And you've got all of those things from a Venn diagram kind of collapsing down. And while you're trying to accomplish that, you've got to do it in a scalable way, which means you have to get away from the old legacy silos and identity stores to something that's much more scalable. But then it also has to be automated and move at machine speed so you can do that continuous auth, right? And so you start putting all this stuff together and say, okay, we're now going to take that enforcement layer and take the policy to the very edge of the service or enforce it at what's known as an API or application program interface. This now starts to become almost unwieldy. And so folks have been a little reticent to do it, right? And so they held on to their identity stores. The problem is, to the last comment around cybersecurity, that's allowed us to become the weak underbelly for all these breaches and hacks, right? It is compromised credentials. And so you've got to get a couple of different things kind of happening simultaneously. One is the users have to have this idea of a consent flow. They have to control who's accessing their data, what data is being accessed, and have the ability to give permissions or credentials and take them away. And we're starting to see a lot of the financial institutions get there. So that's the first step. The second one is there has to be a way for consumers to do this in a more friendly way. Mobile devices, not necessarily logging in something that looks like command line. And we're starting to see that, right? Programmers getting much better at the interface, the bandwidth in the pipe's getting bigger. But most importantly, organizations have to do this within some type of control framework. It's going to be different for citizenry data in the US versus India versus Australia versus Canada. And so depending on where you are in that paradigm, you also have some other constraints. And so identity is both a modernization, know your customer, as well as a control play all at once. And so you've got two sides of that same coin, the numerator and denominator. And so what has to happen to really enable this is you've got to have the business process owners come together with the technical teams to make sure they're doing it in a mindful way. So identity is at the center of that Venn diagram, and a whole lot of good discussion looking forward to on this panel around those.
That's great. And then, just adding on top of that, right, is I know we talk about identity and kind of the notion of different identities you have, but, what are the thoughts just overall for everybody from a question perspective as to, this whole spectrum of fragmented identity is also becoming a problem. So how does that play when we look at things from a identity verification perspective, right? And taking back, if you go back to the zero trust principles around never trust, always verify, and maybe Mike, I'll kind of start, have you kick this off, but, how do you verify that user who is accessing the system? How do you ensure that they are who they say they are?
Well, if it's okay, before I address your question, I want to go back to something that Jason said in the last segment there. And Jason, you brought up a really good comment about users having to have control and consent over how their data is used. I think that's a very important thing to think about. Zero trust, it's an interesting term, and I think it's an unfortunate choice of term. A good friend of mine, his wife works for a large company that's got IT, and she was talking to me about hearing this term zero trust, and she said, what is this? Does this mean we're not trusted? And I say it's an unfortunate kind of term because it's actually quite the opposite. I think when I think of zero trust, Ketan mentioned in the introduction that really people are sort of the new perimeter. This is a term that Amanda Rogerson, one of the other esteemed panelists, said to me, and I thought that was such a good thing, such a good way of putting it, that people need to have that feeling that they are in control, because they're the ones who are going to be deciding how is their data used in the future world of decentralized identity, and they need to have a mechanism to be able to provide that consent. And I'm sorry, Jason, but I'm going to disagree with you on one point, and that is where you said that this is all happening at the peripheral, right? That's at the edge. I would disagree, and I think that if we're doing zero trust properly, we're actually permeating that identity as deep into all the layers as we can. Because as you know, there's no application that operates in a vacuum. Modern applications today are composed of tens and dozens and hundreds of services, sometimes even external to the organization, cloud services are being composed in. And what's really important is that context. Because and identity is providing part of that context to make that decision of should this actually be allowed. So before I address your other question,
That's fine, yeah.
I want to see if I'm interested to hear if Kevin and Ernie want to jump on that at all. Because Jason gave us a ton of stuff to unpack.
We just say, we have to really think about not just authentication and who are you when you access the system, but who are you while you continue to use the system?
Right.
Because there's opportunities for artificial intelligence in the future, potentially for hackers to emulate individuals as well too. So I think the next step will be continuously checking to see that I am who I am while I'm using systems as well too. Identity is kind of this thing that happens in an instant, and that's how we've dealt with it for most of our lives as technologists. We're going to have to think about, instead of a persistent identity, where it just happens to once, where it's a continuous identity while we're continuing to move through systems and whatnot as well. So there's a lot to do and a lot to think about, and a lot of it is philosophical in nature as much as it is technological.
Agreed. Yeah.
No, I would agree. And, the point of ensuring that you have all those steps and having the user provide the proper credentials, but we've seen the challenge that's also created. And I think part of that topic today is around frictionless, and how do we not frustrate, and how do we make sure that zero trust does mean we're not trusting until we have that information. But how do you make it to the point where it comes through and it's very easy, and it creates that frictionless benefit that we're all looking for?
Yeah. So
That's a great segue, actually.
It is,
it's, determining that the person is who they say they are, that instant of authentication that Kevin, you just mentioned, I think that's really key. And your question was, how do we trust our identities in a zero trust world, right? And so knowing who somebody is so central to being able to govern any resources, because in any application, any service, I mean, at the end of the day, the data that an organization owns, it's all there for the service of a user.
Yep.
And I know people will say, well, there's also machine to machine and there's service accounts, but I would argue that even those are, again, they're there to serve a user at the end of the day. That there's a person behind all of those things. So how can we make a decision about whether somebody should be allowed to do something if we don't have strong assurance of who they are? Yep. That's really, I think, the key question. And Ernie, you made a great point about until we trust. And I think there's this core tenet of zero trust that's
Right.
Never trust, always verify. And I would like to change that. I don't think it's very good. I think it should be, don't trust until you verify.
All right.
Because, again, like thinking about, I'm full disclosure, I'm also, I also do development work. I've built applications from the ground up. I know, from all the way down to the database level, there's never going to be, or at least we're not going to be there anytime soon at 100% zero trust. We're not going to get there. So there has to be that chain of trust through those services. And so what's so critical is that at least we're strengthening that link between the identity and the service that initially consumes the identity. And then to your question, strengthening that link between the identity and the actual person.
Right.
And the way we do that, how do we trust? We have to verify better.
Right.
And today we're verifying with knowledge-based factors, with passwords. Okay, we know that's a joke, right? We don't even need to have that discussion today. 2 years ago, when we started BlokSec, people were saying, yeah, passwords are fine, you guys are crazy. Now it's like passwordless is such a big, important thing. But there's MFA, of course, when we talk about verifying an identity, but I would argue MFA also is not good enough. And because, number one, it can be spoofed. It's not as easy. It's better than passwords, but it can be spoofed. And number two, it creates friction. And so that's the biggest problem there, that corporate users, okay, fine, you tell them you have to use MFA, they'll do it, it's their job. But when you get to the larger public, people will actively disable MFA because they cannot deal with the friction, they don't like it. So we need something that provides assurance that the person is who they say they are. And I think the only way we can do that is with proof of possession, which is like a token or something that you have, and proof of biometry, which means that, proof of possession, like a YubiKey, I can drop that, somebody can pick it up, they can use it. Not strong enough, there has to be that biometric proof as well that proves that I'm actually there and that I'm actually consenting to that transaction. And so I think the real challenge for us, I think that's probably well understood, and sort of the challenge for us, and this is kind of what we set out to solve as BlokSec, was how do we bring that really, really strong verification of the identity in a way that's easy for organizations to implement and in a way that's frictionless for the user to use.
Right. Yep. Oh, and that's great, right? And I think, going back to the whole notion of, verifying the users and also the consent element. And I think what we're kind of seeing, the adoption of these technologies, right? And Kevin, being part of Microsoft, and, Microsoft is on this big push to really, have the world move to passwordless, especially with the announcement that came on September 15th, where a lot of the public-facing stuff is, now fully available passwordless. And I know internally, from an organization perspective, you guys are really pushing that across the board too, right? So, how do you see passwordless as an element, for organizations, and can they quickly accelerate the adoption of this? And, one question that also comes to mind, sorry, I know this is a two-question almost, but, I think the other aspect to that is there's the adoption and the acceleration, but then can every industry adopt passwordless, right? So I'd like to sort of at least have you give your thoughts on where you see this, go from a future state perspective, especially coming from Microsoft too, where you guys are really pushing this hard across the board.
Well, I think the main reason why we moved to this elimination of password was, have you ever tried to enter 101 random characters on an Xbox controller? It's really difficult. So
Yes.
that's one of the main reasons I think that we did it. But really, what we would need to do is just stop, annoying and torturing our users. I mean, for years we've given them every 3 months, hey, you got to change it to, 47, not 48 characters. There's got to be, 3 random things, a number, some song lyrics, and an Elven rune in there. And it spends, it should take 2 minutes to reset my password, but it takes half an hour.
Yeah.
So, when we say we can eliminate passwords, or do you want consent, I don't think people, the end user really cares about those things as much as, let me do my job. Just let me get to my work. You're the security professionals. You take care of this, right? And in every other industry, that's how it works. You know, when I walk down the stairs, if they're in disrepair, there's no handrail or whatnot, and I slip and fall, it's the building's fault. It's whoever created the stairs. Why is it in our industry, it's the user's fault when they mess up? We need to take as an industry much more responsibility. We need to fix this. And we do that with empathy. We really have to understand what the users are going through and how they just want to get access to their stuff to do their job. It's up to us, not them, to become security professionals. When I log in the morning, my camera scans me. I don't even know my password anymore. I can't work anywhere else after living in a passwordless environment. Having to enter all those things and remember, it's now become one of the best parts of my job is that I don't have to worry about that stuff. And I find that people that join Microsoft, that's one of the first comments they make is, wow, it's just so easy to do your work here. Creating a great user experience, you know, taking responsibility as an industry for making that happen for users and making it secure is what we need to focus on. And that's really what, you know, we're in business for, is to do exactly that. So that's what I've really learned about passwords and how we need to improve over the last little while. And that's how we approach it with customers. How do we make the user experience great? And how do we make them get their job done quicker? It will save money. It will make them more productive, but it also makes them happier. And that's, you know, an unintended consequence that's truly awesome.
That's great, and I guess I know, and you kind of you know, brought up a really good point around from a workforce experience perspective, and I'm sure, you know, if you had as a consumer accessing services that made life easier from a passwordless perspective, I'm sure it would really delight your day at the end of the day, where I don't have to worry about passwords from a work perspective, but now if I can also enable that similar journey, which is frictionless, from, you know, doing my online banking to going to other sources for the digital stuff that I do online, I'm sure that's going to really, you know, relieve a lot of people for remembering all these passwords. Jason, Ernie, do you guys want to add anything on this topic, especially when it comes to passwordless in the workforce and also on the consumer side of things?
Yeah, so I'll go Ernie and then throw it your way. So what's interesting here is we're both practitioners in this space and consumers of this topic.
Yeah.
So we literally, I can't say drink your own champagne. It's eating our own dog food at times, right? But joking aside, what's interesting, and it goes back to that friction comment. So again, a lot of these principles have been in place for quite some time. You know, the something you know, the something you have, the someone you are. We know that. And pushing that out there in a way that is both secure but usable has been this kind of wonky point. There was a study done, and I think it's about a year or two dated now, that shows consumers are mindful of more friction when they're touching personal information, healthcare information, or banking information. They want to see it slow down. They want to know that there's more there.
Right.
But, you know, so the aforementioned comment, when it's logging their laptop or they're going on to Instagram or Facebook, they just want to pop up. Like, I just want to go. There's nothing out there that's that sensitive. I'm known. Also, for the first time in human history, you've got an entire generation that grew up analog. A group of us on this session right now that were analog and digital, and some digital natives. And so you're going to have a fundamentally different answer to that question based on if people are used to being pushed information, news, newspapers, being able to pull information or get pushed information, depending on their preference. All of us Gen Xers, or someone that only pulls. Like they get inundated by it. So as this stuff starts to push, we have to be mindful of both the consumers and the audience of it, as well as what data set they're actually trying to get to, because that does tweak it a little bit. But at the end of it, what is incumbent on the industry is make sure there is continuous identity proofing happening. Right. Make sure we go passwordless. We know passwords are the weak underbelly. So let's get past it. You know, Microsoft's doing a great job leading this in this area. So we need to continue to push that, but we need to be mindful of the data and sensitive to the workflow and the use cases we're talking about, because consumers will have a different view than employees, et cetera, and privileged access. So we need to not go too far down that rabbit hole, but make sure that we understand who's trying to consume and what they're trying to consume when we walk through those models.
Great points. Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, and just to follow on that, it's also starting to dig deeper once we get past frictionless and okay, we understand that this will benefit, but there are different use cases, and Jason kind of touched on that, whether it's privileged access management or it's standard SSO within two different web applications. You know, how are the solutions benefiting? What are you leveraging? What type of zero trust architecture are you putting in place? Does one solution address it all? And I think it's starting to have that conversation because we've all agreed we're beyond the frictionless part and using passwordless, but now how do you put the best solution in place to reduce that friction in many areas and not just looking at one use case in one area? Because I think that would tend to create more frustration where you show that there is benefit in this area, but we can't do it here yet because we don't know how to address it. I think it's providing that complete approach will be much more helpful.
Great, thank you. Mike, anything you'd like to add?
I'd say to accomplish that, I think it needs to be a process that starts, if you're in an organization and you're an enterprise architect, it starts with setting the direction for the organization that we are going to work towards zero trust, building that into your patterns and building that into your approvals of new technologies, because we know that there are going to be some legacy technologies that are going to take time, but at least if we can work together to kind of bake it into the new things that we're launching, it becomes a process. And in working towards zero trust, we're going to be improving our security posture with every step.
So you kind of bring up a great point there, right? Like bringing in the right people. So if organizations, again, going back to sort of the similar question before, so where can sort of organizations start to say, okay, well, this is where we sort of start building this foundation of moving towards this decentralized authentication. So where do you think organizations can start looking at enabling this rather than sort of boiling the ocean day one?
I'm going to pick up on something that Jason said, and that is that you have to look at the fragmented identity silos. I think if we're talking about any organization that's 2,000 plus, you're likely going to be having multiple identity silos.
Yep.
And you've also got now shadow IT popping up,
Right.
which effectively are cloud identity silos as well that IT may not even know about. So I think number one, you need to consolidate those identities. You need to proliferate identities as well to ensure that everybody in your organization has one. Because I've worked at large retail organizations where you've got hourly workers
Yep.
who still access very critical systems, but because there's a lot of turnover, they don't necessarily get an identity. So to the credit of that organization, that was a priority, and that was a great step towards ensuring those people are authenticated and authorized, because if you don't know who they are, how can you make that decision, right?
Yep.
And then finally, once you've got that, so it's consolidate, proliferate so that everybody has an identity, and then start to drive, like I said, drive that verification deeper into the onion until you can get to that core, so that ideally when you're accessing the data, that's the holy grail. You look at what data is being accessed and you've got rules around who's allowed to access that. Then you're truly protected.
Great. Anybody want to add any additional comments to Mike's?
I could. Two groups I really like to focus on. One are the people that complain the most about passwords. Let's start with them for a pilot. Your repeat offenders for password reset, great place to start.
Yep.
The better choice is the leadership. Tone from the top really matters in cultural change. And if you can get the leadership to onboard and sponsor, and at least a few people in leadership of the organization to be a part of that pilot, then that will change the culture, because it shows that it's important. It shows that they're willing to take on that as well. If you start in IT, it's difficult to get that traction and get that space, but nothing better than protecting the executives, because sometimes they're the worst offenders. There's a lot of overlap sometimes between these two groups, but also tone from the top really is what it takes to build cultural change.
That's great. Jason, Ernie, anything you add from your end? Okay.
No,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, no. So it goes back to that people, process, and product. The weak link in this always people. we make it complicated, people are going to write their passwords down, or they're going to put them in a notepad, or they're not going to password vault it, or they're going to just start replicating them because it got too complicated. It's a really complex password used 60 different times. So we've got to figure out, how to make it easier on the people. They will always, go to the path of least resistance, much like an electron. But we have to enable them to do it, right? And I completely agree with starting with the worst offenders. And tone at the top matters. If the leadership isn't behind it, it doesn't matter how great the new widget is. It's not going to get used.
Great.
Yeah, I agree. I think the test groups are really important, and starting at that executive level is key to help accelerate some of those programs. It's been happening time and time again. I know that a lot of different companies are looking at focusing on brand reputation and starting at the executive level. So I think it's not as odd in this day and age to be able to focus on the executive team to be a test bed for something new that's going to benefit. So I think that's a great an idea that was for now.
That's great. And I think, going back to some of the earlier questions around, right, like, honing back, like I know, when we look at the world of identity, right, there's this concept of identity proofing, there's this concept of KYC, and I think often there's a bit of a misleading from an end user perspective as to what does that really mean, right? Because to me, identity proofing is something versus verifying the identity of someone who's authenticating that. So Mike, do you want to kind of just, based on your experience and sort of some of the things that we're doing, how do you kind of see those two play as we look at identity proofing and what sort of that verifiable identity means?
Yeah, there's overlap there for sure.
Yeah.
So identity proofing to me is the process through which you provide some type of official documentation that says who you are. So an example of identity proofing happens if you go get a passport. You have to provide some type of a letter from a notary, for example, that says this, I know this person, they've lived at this address. That's a form of identity proofing. And so there's digital identity proofing, and I know, Kevin, this is something that Microsoft is getting into, and we're very interested in that service, where you will now have the ability to have this concept of verifiable credential. And a verifiable credential it's different than a verifiable identity. Verifiable credential says, I went to the University of Toronto and I graduated, and in a digital form, somebody can trust that actually did happen.
Yeah.
A verifiable identity is this session, that this connection to this application is coming from Mike. And I know it's Mike because he's proven that it's Mike through some authentication process. And so I think that's where I see that there's a slight perhaps misunderstanding of the difference between those two things. They're complementary though. That's the critical thing I want to say, is that if we can combine the verifiable credential and that verified identity, the KYC that Jason was referring to, and have that be part of a provable identity. So now that when I say verifiable identity, somebody can go back and say, how can you prove it was actually that person? That's really key. Because if you're making a big financial transaction, just look at blockchain, right? If you're moving money on the blockchain, I want to have a digital signature in a place that's stored in a ledger that can be verified, that's transparent, that everybody can see that was me and that transaction was supposed to take place,
right,
and that I had enough money to do that transaction in the first place.
Great, thanks. Anything, Kevin, Jason, do you guys want to add to that?
There's interesting use cases for identity too. What about
Right.
the use case of a refugee who flees their country,
Yeah.
and maybe the regime that's taken over has an incentive to not provide that identity or whatnot? Having a blockchain, irrefutable identity, or a solution like that can really solve some of those big problems that we have as societal problems as well too. So there are opportunities not just to make it easier to log into your social media accounts here, but also really to address some of the human rights challenges
Right.
that we face in this area as well too.
Great point.
No, those are great points, and I think and I think if we look at the whole concept of people and different identities, and I think I think at least I kind of see as sort of the next wave, right? Because going back to the comment that I kind of made earlier, right? Like people are becoming the perimeter, but then also as we as people, we have these different personas from an identity perspective, right? Like I have this persona of me working for an organization. So I have my workforce identity. Then I have my, I would say social life identity, right? So I think we're also now creating these other trails as we kind of go through. So it's also going to be very interesting to see that as we move towards the future, what is this world from a digital aspect look like, right? And I think really it's going to, I kind of go back and say, like, all these different personas we're going to have, is there a way to sort of tie these different personas and say, yes, this is who Ernie is as a person, and Ernie has these different personas that he interacts with, right? So I think, I'm not too sure if you want to add anything to that, but I know that's kind of another interesting topic or area that I kind of see as, identity companies out there start looking at these to say, okay, well, how can we solve this fundamental issue of driving the persona of that individual?
I would say that is inevitable.
Yeah.
I would say that is just a matter of time. And so it's a question of, who's going to be the leader in making that happen? Because once it happens, that's going to be, you look at Web 3.0, it's a paradigm shift, and it needs to have that level of personal identity that you mentioned, that it's you as a person. That's such an important concept.
Right.
And privacy. It's been brought up several times today. It's gonna be huge because as you said, you're leaving a trail, and sometimes you don't want everybody to see that trail. Some of those things, your medical information, for example, has to be kept private. So.
Yeah. Oh, that's and that's great. And I think just to, I know we're coming towards the end, so I'm going to try to wrap up a little bit over here. But I think in general, we've talked enough about sort of the identity verification. We've talked about the consent-based authorization, which I think is kind of another interesting area where we're also seeing a lot of sort of advancements in that area with, there's a lot of different consortiums out there that are help driving to sort of put some model in place. And I know Microsoft is trying to do certain things too, and I know we've been looking at things too. So I'd like to get some insight from you and to see if anybody else wants to chime in on that.
On the consortiums.
Well, not necessarily consortiums, but just really help looking at why is that consent element more important as we look at the overall flow.
Well, okay,
right?
so that it's a great tie into that the previous question. And guys, please jump in. I don't want to monopolize all the airspace here. I know I have an unfair advantage being in person, but when we're talking about KYC and we're talking about verifiable credentials, I gave the example of like my university degree, right? Not everybody should know that. Not everybody needs to know that. And so the consent part of it is, if I now have some verifiable credentials, if those exist, and of course those exist, until recently, consumers have had effectively zero control. When you sign up for a Google service, nobody reads that, first of all. Well, maybe lawyers do. I certainly don't. But you're agreeing to share that information everywhere, right? And whether you agree to it or not, companies are using any technique they can to figure out what you're doing. And I think that when I say it's inevitable, it's that people are starting to demand that increased privacy and that shift to the consent model, where I'm soon going to be able to say, no, they don't get to know my age. They don't get to know where I live. That's this very common example. You just need to know that I'm old enough to buy this marijuana. I mean, alcohol. Canada, sorry guys.
Same in the States. Yeah, I mean, to kind of riff off that a little bit, and for our non-technical users, here's a good analogy. Here to date, identity has been like the sewer system in London. It kind of works. A whole lot of people built on top of other pipes and flows, and no one really knows how it works until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, you got to go figure it out really fast because someone else got in there and did something bad. Identity 3.0, zero trust for identity, self-sovereign identity, whatever little moniker we put on it, has to become more like a highway system with maps. Right. So the consent and the context is relevant. And the user knows, am I going down a dirt road, a side street, or am I getting on the Autobahn? Because if I'm driving an ATV or a Jeep, I don't want to be on the Autobahn. But the same vein, if I'm on a Porsche 911, I don't want to be on the dirt road. So it becomes very situational aware. We've got to get to that. And users are now getting educated, right? We've had a whole lot of breaches. People now have context for where their data is going, privacy issues that are both market driven as well as regulatory driven and meeting in the middle. But until we get to that point when users can really control the consent and the flow of their own access, we're not fully going to be there. That's my final point.
Right. No, that's great. And you definitely brought a very important point there, Jason, too, around is having control over data, right? Because I think today, one of the fundamental challenges, and again, I guess when we look at the corporate world, it's a little bit different, but that we as consumers of different services, we in essence are really giving away all those elements of all the data that we have related to each service and every account we kind of go and sign up, right? So so we're now leaving traces of all this data, and I think it's becoming also kind of critical where we as users now need some capability or ways to kind of control that and say, well, yes, this is my data, but I want to allow and provide you the permission to sort of, share certain aspects of this data rather than giving my life history across, right? And I think that's another area that I kind of see is going to play an interesting role as we move towards, the decentralized identity model or whatever that thing is going to be from a decentralization perspective.
Just
right?
remember, if the product is free, you are the product.
You're the product.
Oh,
Exactly.
And that has to change.
Yeah, exactly.
It's going to change.
Yeah,
Ernie, you
That's-
wanted to get
and
into
guys, real quick, just to kind of, as we've had this, discussion, it's, looking at that phased approach and rolling out zero trust, but it's also at a higher level. Where do you bring in the verifiable and what would be verifiable, the consortium as well? So I think that's the phased approach we're looking at as well at
Right.
even higher. So as we're looking at that understanding to secure our businesses and the end users, and then how are we coming about the best way to provide the right information for that right use case, right? That right situation or example
Right.
that we're all talking about. So I think that's something as, security experts and opportunities to talk at CyberX are thought-provoking and how we have to drive towards that with the different companies we all work with.
No, and that kind of makes sense. And, I think, obviously this has been a very interesting conversation and topic today. And I know we can go on for hours over here. But again, I think this has been a very interesting conversation today. And in closing, do the panelists want to say anything? Any last thoughts that you would like to share with the audience?
I can start quick. Hey, this is a CISO forum. So what's in it for the CISO? You're being hammered by your executives or your board when they see something in the headlines. Are we secure? What are your measures? And you're reacting. What is their mean time to resolution or whatnot? Take a proactive stance and say, hey, I want to move to zero trust. Give the board a KPI to manage you on, which is your maturity or your adoption of zero trust or passwordless or whatnot. Really set your agenda as the KPI that you're reporting up, and help them help you to build the progress and hold you accountable as well too. This is a great opportunity to get what you want and to also help the board provide oversight, and your executives know that you're doing something proactive that's measurable, that's not a ridiculous KPI. It's something that really can matter.
Thanks, Kevin. Jason, or
Yeah. Maybe
go ahead, Ernie, sorry.
Oh, go for it, Ernie.
Oh, just kind of going through as the discussion is, pulled this together and putting zero trust in, but how do these solutions differentiate? Right. Everybody in the market today will have a paragraph on how they support zero trust. And I think that's helped wash out some of the messaging and benefit and what is trying to be accomplished. So I think it is key to really drill into how do these solutions differentiate and drive towards that goal of providing the zero trust architecture implemented, and then looking at, are they verifying the identities? Do we have validation by some type of governing body that is going to give us that reassurance that we're looking for? I think that's where the CISOs and executives need to start looking at as they're starting to implement and execute on the zero trust strategy.
Great. Thanks, Ernie. Jason?
And finally, I'd say for the CISO organization, break it down into why statements, not just how statements.
Right.
The technology to do this is really cool for all of us technologists. It's kind of the next gen. It's identity 3.0, web 3.0, all kinds of 3.0s, but explain why it matters. And it's really simple. Basically, zero trust identity is the brakes on the race car, not to slow it down, but so it can go faster and you can grow better and you can stay in front of trends that are happening in a digital way. And start to articulate those why statements back to your C-suite and board. It'll be fundamentally different than just getting into how do we do it and then a whole 72-page architecture on the details of it. So yes, that matters, but you've got to go up a level as well.
Great. Thanks, Mike. I know we have a couple of seconds left over here. Anything you want to add?
I'm just going to speak to maybe the younger members of the audience and the sort of the new entrepreneurs. If you're building something new, think about identity and think about how that identity and the context of that identity can be used to keep your service secure. Don't just rely on some third party and make it their problem. Think about it and build it into your product and build it in at every layer. Don't have to come back and retrofit it later because that becomes a dog's breakfast.
So really follow the security by design, privacy by design principles to ensure that you're just not building for the sake of building something, but you're also enabling that trust and verification in every step of your process. And again, thanks everybody for joining us today, and thanks to the panelists for their time today. Really appreciate it, and everybody have a great day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.